Hi everybody, and welcome to this video on the ethical considerations in psychology. This is part of the science inquiry skills that you need to know about in terms of the ethical protocols that need to be in place when we do experiments and investigations in psychology. So let's get into it. So all investigations and experiments need to be approved by an ethics committee. So psychologists can't just go ahead and run with their experiments without it first getting approved, because obviously it is the obligation of the psychologist to ensure participants' safety. So they will submit what's called a proposal to the ethics committee as to what they want to actually do in their experiment or investigation. If it's approved by the ethics committee, they can go ahead and do it. If it's rejected by the ethics committee, they then need to go back and start again and rework their proposal to make it a bit more ethically sound. So there are 5 main ethical principles in psychology that we will go through. We'll also look at some others at the end of this video that we also need to take into consideration, but there are 5 main ethical principles that we'll talk about first. So informed consent, voluntary participation, confidentiality, right to withdraw, and debriefing. So informed consent. This is when the participants are informed of all their rights, the risks, and the aim of the investigation. It is their right to know this. So it is only fair that the participant knows why the experiment is being done in the first place and any potential risks that may come about it. They are also informed of all of their rights, so their right to withdraw, right to remain confidential, and so on. So when establishing informed consent, this obviously happens before we do the investigation in the first place. All right, so this is the first step of the ethical process. Now, informed consent needs to be in the first language to participants. If someone, for example, English was not their first language, an interpreter would need to be brought in just so they are absolutely 100% sure they know what they're agreeing to as part of the experiment. Informed consent must never involve bribery or coercion, so we can never bribe our participants or coerce our participants. Like I said to you in class, I can't say to you all, if I wanted to use you for my participants in an experiment I was running, I can't say, oh guys, I'll give you all $50 if you be a part of my experiment. That obviously is not okay. I'm taking advantage of your financial situation. I can't coerce you either. I can't say, oh, I'll make sure you all get A's in psychology. That's not okay to do that. That's very ethically questionable. Now, we always get a consent form, all right? We must get the consent in writing. Verbal consent is not enough, all right? So a consent form is a must. And participants under 18 must have parent or caregiver consent. All right, our next ethical principle is voluntary participation. So kind of an extension, really, of informed consent. Participants cannot be bribed, threatened, or coerced. So I can't threaten participants either. So I couldn't say to you all, for example, if you don't participate in my experiment, I'm going to fail you all. That's obviously not okay. You can't do that. And there should be no negative consequences for refusal. So if someone has heard of the informed consent process, or they've heard everything that is involved in that process, and they're still not feeling 100% comfortable or like they would like to participate, and they say, no, I don't want to participate, that's absolutely fine. There should be no negative consequences for refusal. Okay, confidentiality. Pretty much as it says. Sometimes this is called privacy, both are correct. But yeah, confidentiality is the official term. So no personal information should be released about the participants. Often they are given an ID number. That's my third dot point there. They're given ID numbers, and that's how they're known as, just to protect their identification and protect themselves in terms of their private information. Participants can remain anonymous as well. So if they're in a focus group or they would prefer to remain anonymous, that's absolutely fine. Now, this not only is throughout the experiment itself, but this applies to the storage of the data, the access of the data, and the publication of the data. So we can't obviously have names or personal details published in our prac reports, for example, because that will breach the participants' confidentiality. So we want to make sure that their privacy is protected. This also makes it more likely that they will give free information, so they'll be more honest with their information because they know that their identities will be protected. Okay, right to withdraw. As it says, participants have the right to withdraw at any time without having to give a reason. So they can just pull out halfway through the experiment if they're not feeling comfortable. This should not incur any negative consequences either. So if someone is halfway through an experiment, they're not feeling comfortable and they would like to withdraw, it is their ethical right to do so. And debriefing. Now this occurs at the end of the experiment or investigation. All right, so this is after it's finished. The researcher then explains the process of what's going to happen next with the data. So how the data is going to be collated, how it's going to be presented and made available to the participants themselves, because that's an essential process. The researcher will also answer any questions that the participants have and will inform them of any deception. So sometimes in order to establish valid data, we need to falsify the true aim, or we didn't reveal all of the information in the informed consent process. We only do that if there's no other way to achieve valid data. So if there is any deception or there is any bending of the truth in terms of the informed consent process, we must tell them in debriefing, no matter how small it is. So some other ethical considerations that we need to consider as well where appropriate. Accurate reporting. So it's the duty of the researcher to publish their results. Otherwise, why are we doing experiments at all if we're not going to publish our results? It's the duty that we have to do that. We also need to make sure that we give complete information about the research and not fabricate the results. Okay, so we can't fabricate the results. That's obviously not an ethical thing to do. We also need to make sure we don't take credit for other psychologists or researchers' work. So if we were working as a team, or there was a psychologist panel that was a team that worked on an experiment, we need to obviously make sure that they're given credit for their contribution and not take all the credit for ourselves. So in other words, just don't plagiarize, as I've said there. So we need to give, when we do our reports, they need to be as accurate as possible, give complete information. We need to obviously publish them in the first place and not fabricate or take credit for other researchers' work on the results themselves. Now, like I said before, sometimes we need to lie or deceive our participants. It's the only way to actually establish valid data. So some investigation needs that bias to establish the data in the first place. Otherwise, there's no point in doing the investigation at all. Now, we only deceive our participants if there's no significant physical, emotional, psychological, financial, or social harm done. Now, that term significant, like I said in class, is very subjective. But the ethics committee, that's their job. If it's not going to be significant enough that it's going to harm the participants in any of these ways, then it will still often be approved because we need to advance the field and we need to get valid data. But if the harm of deception is seen to be too significant, the proposal will get rejected and the researcher needs to come up with another more ethical way. So yes, deception is done, but only if there's no significant harm. Like I said before, we only do it if there's no other way to achieve the aim of the research, and we must tell them in debriefing. We can't just let them go and not tell them what happened. Even if the deception is very, very small, they still must be told. Okay, so research on animals. This is certainly worth considering, obviously, because we do animal research in psychology. The good news is that Code of Ethics in Australia regarding animal research is very, very strict. So there's to be no harm to the animals and they need to be treated ethically and with respect. So the researcher needs to consider the following. The welfare of the animal. If the animal is going to be put in significant stress because of the purpose of the research, then that's obviously not an ethical way to go about using animals, and it will get rejected, as it should be. Making sure that the use of the animal is justified. Do we actually have to use the animals at all, or can we come up with another option? Obviously, like I said before, avoiding pain and distress to the animal, that's just not okay under any circumstances. And of course, knowing the correct maintenance and care and handling of that animal. So how we care for a dog, for example, is different to how we take care of a snake. If we were using those as part of our research, we would obviously need to know how to take care of those animals while they're in our care and while we are using them for our research. So that's my dog there, okay, Bentley, which I've shown you before. So again, the good news is the Code of Ethics in Australia is very, very strict. I am an animal lover as well, and yes, in psychological research, animals are very well taken care of. Okay, so that is the video finished on ethical research in psychology. As always, guys, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, Happy revising. Bye.